a crying CEO, a feared Mafia boss, and a homeless black child at midnight. One question, asked without fear, changed everything. Midnight, an empty city street. Marcus Hale sits alone on the curb in a black tailor coat, head in his hands, shoulders shaking. The man who ruled boardrooms and streets alike is breaking in public. 12 hours ago, Marcus Hale controlled everything. His empire, his money, his power. Tonight, it's all slipping through his fingers. And by morning, consequences will come that even his influence can't stop. Then footsteps approach. Soft, careful, bare feet on cold pavement. A child steps out of the shadows. No shoes, no home, no fear. He looks at the most dangerous man in the city and asks one simple question. The street is almost silent at midnight, lit by flickering street lamps that stretch long shadows across empty sidewalks. Most businesses are closed, their glass fronts dark and lifeless. The city, usually loud and restless, seems to be holding its breath. On the curb outside a towering office building that once carried his name sits Marcus Hale. He doesn't belong there. At least, he never did before. Marcus is in his early 40s, wearing a coat tailored to command respect. The kind worn by men who never wait, never ask, never lose. But tonight, the coat hangs heavy on him. His posture is folded inward, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands as quiet control gives way to raw, uncontrollable sobs. 12 hours earlier, Marcus Hale was untouchable. CEO by day, Mafia boss by night, a man feared by rivals and obeyed without question. Then the cracks appeared. Betrayal inside his organization. Deals collapsing. Enemies moving faster than he anticipated. Lawyers whispering words he hadn't heard in years. Indictments, warrants, no way out. By nightfall, Marcus had lost more than power. He had lost certainty, control, the illusion that he could outrun consequence forever. So he came here, to the place where his empire began, where ambition first hardened into cruelty, where decisions were made that couldn't be undone. He sat down, and for the first time in decades, he let himself break. He doesn't notice the footsteps at first. Small ones, light ones. When a voice finally speaks, it isn't afraid. "Mister, why are you crying?" Marcus doesn't look up. He doesn't need to. He already knows this moment shouldn't be happening. Because standing in front of him is a homeless black child named Elijah, and the question the boy is about to ask will shatter the last wall Marcus Hale has left. Marcus Hale had built his name the way men build fortresses, stone by stone, without mercy, without apology. In boardrooms, his voice was calm and precise, every sentence measured, every pause deliberate. Executives twice his age listened when he spoke, not because he was loud, but because he never wasted words. When Marcus Hale said something would happen, it did. When he said someone was finished, they were. By day, he was the face of Hale Consolidated, a global enterprise with interests stretching across finance, logistics, real estate, and technology. His photo appeared in business magazines beside headlines that praised his discipline, his vision, his unusual ability to anticipate markets before they moved. Analysts called him ruthless but brilliant. Investors called him dependable. Governments called him useful. By night, his name carried a different weight. In quieter rooms, far from glass towers and conference tables, Marcus Hale was spoken of carefully, not whispered, because fear didn't always need volume, but never casually. He controlled routes, favors, debts, and silence. People disappeared from deals, from cities, from entire lives, and no one ever proved his involvement. He didn't need to threaten. His reputation did that for him. Marcus never raised his voice. He never needed to. Fear followed him like a shadow. It showed itself in the way people stood straighter when he entered a room, the way conversations stopped just a second too early, the way phones were answered immediately when his name appeared on the screen. Even those who had never met him felt his presence, like a storm you sensed before the clouds arrived. And Marcus believed for a long time that this was power. He believed control was safety, that distance was strength, that if he never let anyone close enough to matter, no one could ever hurt him the way poverty once had, the way weakness once had, the way begging once had. He remembered being younger, hungrier, remembered sleeping in his car, counting coins, promising himself he would never be at the mercy of anyone again. Somewhere along the way, survival had turned into dominance, caution into cruelty, protection into obsession. But from the outside, Marcus Hale was untouchable. He lived in a penthouse high above the city, surrounded by glass and steel, where the world looked small and manageable below him. His security detail was discreet but constant. His schedule was tight, his circle tighter. No wife, no children, no visible attachments. People assumed it was by choice. They were right. Attachments made you predictable. Predictability made you vulnerable. That philosophy had guided him for decades, and it worked until it didn't. Because empires don't collapse loudly at first. They crack quietly. A delayed call, a mispayment, a face that doesn't meet your eyes, a deal that takes too long to close. Marcus noticed everything. He always had. But even he couldn't control time forever. By the time the betrayal surfaced, it came from multiple directions at once. A trusted lieutenant moved money without permission. A partner cut a deal with enemies Marcus thought were buried. Legal pressure began to tighten in places he'd once considered untouchable. For the first time in years, Marcus wasn't ahead of the board. And fear, the same fear he had spent a lifetime weaponizing, began circling him instead. That was the part no one ever saw. They didn't see the nights he stood alone in his penthouse, staring at the city lights, realizing how quiet his life truly was. Didn't see the way his chest tightened when the room was empty, when there was no one to command, no one to intimidate, no one to impress. Didn't see the cost of being feared by everyone and known by no one. So when Marcus Hale found himself sitting on a curb at midnight, head bowed, breath uneven, suit wrinkled and dignity unraveling, it wasn't just a weight of consequences pressing down on him. It was the weight of a life built entirely on being untouchable, finally realizing that power had never protected him from himself. And that was the man Elijah would meet. Not the legend, not the threat, not the empire. Just a man who had spent his entire life making sure no one ever saw him break. Until the night he did. The city had stripped itself down to silence by midnight. Marcus Hale sat on the curb across from the building that bore his fingerprints more than his name. The glass facade reflected a fractured version of him. Bent shoulders, loosened coat, a man folded inward where he once stood immovable. The streetlight above flickered, humming softly, as if unsure whether to stay on or give up too. 12 hours earlier, Marcus had been untouchable. Now his phone lay dark in his hand, heavier than it had ever felt. No missed calls, no messages, no loyal voices rushing in to fix things. The silence wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. People didn't abandon power. They abandoned risk. And tonight, Marcus Hale had become exactly that. He replayed the day in pieces, not in order. The meeting that ended too quickly. The pause before a trusted man answered a simple question. The way the room shifted when the truth surfaced. Money moved without permission. Alliances broken behind his back. Legal pressure closing in from angles he hadn't guarded. He had spent years mastering control, and yet the collapse hadn't come from chaos. It came from precision, from people who learned from him. By evening, the walls were closing in. Advisors stopped offering solutions and started offering distance. Security calls went unanswered. The city that once bent to his will continued moving without him, indifferent, unbothered. Marcus drove without direction, past places he used to own, until his hands began to shake on the steering wheel. That terrified him more than any enemy ever had. So he stopped, parked, walked, and somehow ended up here. The curb was cold through his coat, the concrete unforgiving. Marcus leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and pressed his palms into his eyes as if he could physically hold himself together. His breathing broke first, short, uneven pulls of air that refused to settle. Then came the weight in his chest, sharp and suffocating, as though something long buried had decided it was done waiting. He laughed once, bitter and hollow. All that power, all that fear he commanded, and not a single thing he could use now. Marcus had always believed power meant options, that money and influence created exits where others saw walls. But tonight, there were no doors opening, no back channels, No leverage left to pull. The machinery he built to keep himself untouchable had turned cold and mechanical, following its own momentum without him at the center. For the first time in his life, Marcus Hale didn't know what came next. That uncertainty cracked something open. The tears came without warning, hot and relentless. He didn't bother wiping them away. Didn't check who might be watching. Shame had already burned through him earlier in the day. What remained was exhaustion, so deep it felt structural, like it had been holding him upright for years and finally gave out. He thought of all the times he'd stood in rooms where men pleaded, begging for mercy, for time, for understanding. He had listened with a neutral face, unmoved, convinced that emotions were weaknesses to be managed, not shared. Now he understood something he never had before. Power didn't erase pain. It only delayed it. Footsteps echoed somewhere behind him. Marcus barely registered them. At this point, it didn't matter who saw him. By morning, his name would be everywhere anyway. Stripped of mystery and myth, reduced to headlines and accusations. The steps slowed, then stopped. Marcus stayed where he was, head bowed, shoulders rising and falling unevenly. He expected a voice, harsh, cautious, professional. Someone asking questions. Someone demanding something. Instead, what came was small, uncertain, honest. "Mister, are you okay?" Marcus flinched. The voice didn't belong to the night. It didn't belong to this street or this moment. He lowered his hands, slightly, but didn't look up. His voice came out rough, scraped raw by crying. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered. "Go home." There was a pause, long enough to feel intentional. "I don't have one." That stopped him. Marcus lifted his head slowly, eyes red, vision blurred. Standing a few feet away was a child, thin, dark-skinned, wrapped in clothes too worn and too big, barefoot on the cold pavement. The boy's posture wasn't defensive. It wasn't timid either. He stood the way someone stands when they've learned early that fear doesn't always help. Marcus Hale, CEO, kingmaker, architect of fear, had faced down men with guns and smiles sharper than knives. But he had never known what to do with a child like this. And in that moment, with his power stripped bare and his walls already in ruins, Marcus felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not threat, not danger, but the unsettling sense that whatever came next would matter more than everything that had already fallen apart. The boy didn't step closer right away. He stayed where the edge of the streetlight faded into shadow, as if he understood instinctively that crossing that invisible line mattered. Marcus noticed everything about him in pieces. The way his shoulders were slightly hunched against the cold, the sleeves of his hoodie frayed at the cuffs, the quiet steadiness in his stance. Too calm for someone his age, too practiced at standing alone in places no child should have to stand. Marcus straightened a little, more out of habit than intention. For years, his presence alone had been enough to make grown men retreat. This child didn't move. "You shouldn't be out this late," Marcus said, his voice low, still rough around the edges. "This isn't a safe place." The boy considered that, not with fear, but with thought. "Neither are most places," he replied. His voice was soft, but it didn't tremble. "But sometimes you end up where you end up." Marcus frowned despite himself. He wasn't used to being answered like that, certainly not by a child. "Where's your family?" he asked. The boy shifted his weight, hands slipping into the pockets of his hoodie. "I had one," he said simply. "Not anymore." The words weren't dramatic. They weren't heavy with self-pity. They were stated the way someone might mention the weather, acknowledging reality without arguing with it. Marcus felt a strange tightening in his chest. He'd heard men lie smoothly under pressure, watched them cry when cornered, listened to rehearsed stories meant to earn mercy. This wasn't any of that. This was honesty stripped down to its bones. "What's your name?" Marcus asked. "Elijah." The name settled between them. Marcus nodded once. "You shouldn't talk to strangers," he said, defaulting to logic, to rules. "Especially not men like me." Elijah tilted his head, studying him more closely now. "You look scary," he admitted, "but not right now." That earned a short, humorless breath from Marcus. "I've been called worse." "I believe that," Elijah said. He took a tentative step forward, just enough of the streetlight to catch his face. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. His eyes were sharp, observant, the kind that had learned to read situations quickly. Survival eyes. Marcus had seen that look before, on men who grew up hard, who learned early that softness came at a cost. Seeing it on a child unsettled him in a way he didn't like. "Why are you crying?" Elijah asked. Marcus looked away, jaw tightening. "That's none of your business." Elijah didn't retreat. He didn't push either. He simply waited, the way someone waits when they've learned that silence can do more than force ever could. Marcus exhaled slowly. "Because things fall apart," he said finally. "Even things you think you built to last." Elijah nodded, as if that made sense. "My mom used to say that." He offered. "She said things break when they're built too tight." Marcus glanced at him sharply. "Your mom sounds wise." "She was," Elijah said. A beat passed. "She's gone." The night seemed to lean in around them. Marcus studied the boy again, really looked this time. Bare feet planted on unforgiving concrete. Clothes worn thin by too many nights outside. And yet there was no begging in his posture. No fear curling inward. Elijah stood in the open, unprotected, in a world Marcus knew was brutal even to adults. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus asked quietly. Elijah shrugged, a man sitting on the ground. "That's it." Marcus pressed. Elijah met his eyes. "That's enough." Something about that landed harder than Marcus expected. For decades, his identity had been constructed layer by layer. Titles, power, reputation, fear. This child had stripped all of it away in a single sentence. Around them, the city remained still. No sirens, no traffic, just a low hum of electricity and the shared quiet between two people who had no business meeting each other here. Elijah took another step closer now, close enough that Marcus could see the dirt under his fingernails, the faint scar near his eyebrow, evidence of a life lived without protection. "Aren't you afraid?" Marcus asked, not masking his surprise. "Talking to someone like me, being out here alone." Elijah considered the question carefully. "I was afraid when I was little," he said, "but fear didn't help much. So I stopped listening to it all the time." Marcus felt something shift, small but unmistakable. This child was standing in a place where fear should have ruled, where men like Marcus had built their power on making sure it did. And yet Elijah stood there unshaken. In that moment, Marcus realized something unsettling. For the first time in years, fear wasn't the strongest thing in the space around him. Something quieter was. And whatever it was, it had just stepped out of the shadows. Marcus had been questioned his entire life, by lawyers who circled words like traps, by rivals who asked questions meant to expose weakness, by subordinates who pretended curiosity while seeking leverage. Every question came with an angle, a demand, a cost. Elijah's didn't. The boy stood a few feet from him now, hands tucked into the sleeves of his hoodie, eyes steady in a way that made Marcus uncomfortable, not because there was challenge in them, but because there wasn't. Elijah wasn't trying to win anything. He wasn't afraid of losing anything either. "Can I ask you something?" Elijah said. Marcus almost laughed. "You already have." Elijah smiled faintly, then grew serious again. "This one's different." Marcus studied him, then nodded once. "Go on." Elijah looked at him, not at the suit, not at the tension still coiled in his shoulders, but at his face. At the cracks he hadn't bothered hiding anymore. "Who are you when no one's scared of you?" The question landed quietly. No accusation, no judgment, just truth, placed gently between them. Marcus opened his mouth, and nothing came out. He had answers for everything else. He could explain markets collapsing, alliances breaking, violence escalating. He could justify every hard decision he'd ever made. He could tell you why fear worked, why control was necessary, why softness was dangerous. But this, he looked down at his hands. They were steady now, but they didn't feel powerful. They felt ordinary. Human. "I don't know," he said finally. His voice was lower than before, stripped of authority. "I've never had to think about that." Elijah nodded, as if that response mattered more than anything else Marcus could have said. That's what I thought. Marcus frowned slightly. "You're not afraid of me," he said. "Why?" Elijah shrugged. "You're already hurting." The words were simple. They cut anyway. Marcus leaned back against the curb, staring up at the streetlight. "You shouldn't talk like that to people you don't know." "I know," Elijah said, "but my mom used to say truth doesn't wait for permission." Marcus swallowed. "Your mom said a lot of things." "She had to," Elijah replied. "She knew she wouldn't be around forever." That sat between them longer than silence. Marcus felt something tighten in his throat. He'd built his life around permanence. Structures, systems, safeguards meant to last beyond him. And here was a child who'd learned, far too early, that nothing stayed. "What do you want?" Marcus asked quietly. "From me?" Elijah blinked. "Nothing." Marcus looked at him sharply. "Everyone wants something." "Not everyone," Elijah said. "Sometimes people just want to understand." Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Understanding had never been currency in his world, only leverage. "You look like someone who spent a long time being strong," Elijah continued, "and forgot how to be anything else." Marcus closed his eyes. The city hummed around them, distant and indifferent. Somewhere far away, sirens wailed and faded. But here, on this stretch of concrete, time felt suspended. "You think strength is a problem?" Marcus asked. "I think pretending you don't feel things makes them hurt longer," Elijah said. "That's what happened to my mom." Marcus turned to him. "What do you mean?" "She got sick," Elijah said softly, "but she didn't tell anyone. She didn't want to be weak. By the time she did, it was too late." Marcus felt the weight of that settle deep in his chest. He thought of all the times he'd ignored warning signs, all the nights he'd pushed through exhaustion, through doubt, through the quiet voice that said something wasn't right, because stopping felt like losing. Elijah looked at him again. "Carefully now. Are you scared?" Marcus didn't answer right away. Fear had always been something he gave, not something he admitted to feeling. "Yes," he said finally. "I am." Elijah nodded. "That's okay." The simplicity of that nearly broke him. "Scared doesn't mean you're bad," Elijah added. "It just means you still care." Marcus laughed under his breath. "The sound rough but real. You talk like someone much older than you are." Elijah smiled this time, small and tired. Life does that. They sat there, side by side, but not touching, the distance between them respectful, intentional. Then Elijah asked a question, the one Marcus will remember long after this night faded. "If you couldn't scare anyone anymore," Elijah said, "what kind of man would you want to be?" Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not collapse. Awaken. And for the first time in years, the answer didn't come from power or fear or control, but from a place he'd nearly forgotten existed. Silence. Honest. Unprotected. And waiting to be filled. Marcus didn't answer right away. The question Elijah had asked still hung in the air, quiet but heavy, like something alive. If you couldn't scare anyone anymore, what kind of man would you want to be? It wasn't the kind of question Marcus could outrun. It didn't challenge his authority or threaten his position. It simply waited. He shifted on the curb, feeling the ache in his back, the cold seeping through the fabric of his coat. All his life, discomfort had been something he removed, paid away, threatened away, controlled into submission. Tonight, it stayed. "I built everything on control," Marcus said at last. His voice was steadier now, but emptier too. "I thought if I controlled enough pieces, nothing could touch me." Elijah listened, knees drawn up slightly, hands clasped together as if he were holding something fragile. He didn't interrupt. He never did. Marcus stared out at the street, at the empty stretch of pavement that suddenly felt too honest. "People listened to me because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't," he continued. "Deals worked because no one wanted to test me. Silence was easy. Obedience was guaranteed." He shook his head. "I told myself it was necessary. That fear was just another tool. And now," Elijah asked quietly. Marcus exhaled. "Now none of it matters." He thought of the calls that hadn't been returned, The favors that expire the moment risk outweighed reward. The men who once swore loyalty now calculating their distance. Fear, he realized, had never been loyalty at all. It was a lease, temporary, conditional, revocable at the first sign of weakness. I can't threaten what's already gone, Marcus said. I can't control what's already falling. Elijah nodded, absorbing that. My mom used to say control feels strong until it's the only thing you have. Marcus looked at him. What did she mean? She meant if you don't know how to care. Elijah said, you won't know what to do when control stops working. The word settled in Marcus's chest, pressing gently but persistently. He'd spent decades making sure control never stopped working. And in doing so, he'd never learned what came after. I don't know how to be anything else, Marcus admitted. The confession surprised him with how easily it came. Every time I let go, something bad happened, so I tightened my grip again and again. Elijah glanced down at his own hands. Holding on too tight makes your hands hurt, he said, and you drop things anyway. Marcus let out a short breath that might have been a laugh. You're saying I did this to myself. I'm saying you tried to protect yourself, Elijah replied. But protection isn't the same as living. Marcus closed his eyes. Images rose uninvited. Rooms full of people who waited for him to speak. Dinners eaten alone. Nights spent staring at ceilings too high to echo. Power had filled space, but it had never filled silence. I thought if I stayed in control, he said, I'd never feel this. What does this feel like? Elijah asked. Marcus searched for the word. Like I built a cage and called it kingdom. The city seemed to breathe around them, a low, constant hum. Somewhere, a car passed. Somewhere else, a door slammed. Life went on, unconcerned with his realization. I don't know what happens next, Marcus said. Everything I know how to do, it doesn't work here. Elijah looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time Marcus saw something like concern in his eyes. Not fear, not pity, just recognition. That's when people usually start changing, Elijah said. Marcus frowned. Or breaking. Sometimes those are the same thing, Elijah replied. But breaking isn't always the end. Marcus leaned back, resting his head briefly against the cool stone of the building behind him. Control had been his armor. Without it, he felt exposed, raw, smaller than he'd ever been. But in that smallness, there was something else too, space. For the first time, Marcus said quietly, I can't force my way out of this. Elijah's voice was gentle. Then maybe you don't have to. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at the child beside him. A boy who owned nothing, commanded no one, and yet stood unafraid in a world Marcus had bent with fear. Power had failed him, and in its absence, something unfamiliar stirred. Not strength as he'd known it, but the possibility that being unable to control the outcome didn't mean he was finished. It meant he was finally at the beginning of something he'd never allowed himself to face. Who he was when power meant nothing at all. Marcus had always believed there was a limit to how much a person could feel before something shut down. A wall, a switch, a point where the mind protected itself by going numb. That belief unraveled quietly. It began with a tremor in his hands, barely noticeable, easy to dismiss. Then his breath shortened again, shallow pulls of air that refused to deepen no matter how hard he tried. The city felt suddenly closer, louder, pressing it on him from every direction. He stood up abruptly, as if movement might restore order. It didn't. The street tilted, not physically, but internally, like the ground beneath his certainty had shifted. Marcus took a step, then another, before stopping. He planted his feet and stared at nothing, jaw clenched, eyes burning. I can't fix this, he said, more to himself than to Elijah. I don't know how. Elijah remained seated, watching him carefully. You don't have to fix it right now. Marcus shook his head. That's all I've ever done. His voice rose despite himself. Fix things. Control outcomes. Make problems disappear. He laughed once, sharp and cracked. And now I can't even tell what's broken. The laughter died quickly. What replaced it was something heavier. Images surged forward. faces he hadn't allowed himself to remember, men he'd crushed without a second thought, deals that had ruined lives he'd never bothered to learn the names of, promises he'd made to himself long ago, quietly broken one by one in the name of survival. His chest tightened painfully. "I told myself it was necessary," Marcus said, his voice beginning to shake, "that I was protecting something, that the ends justified everything." He dragged a hand down his face. "But I don't even know what the end was supposed to be anymore." Elijah stood then, slowly, deliberately, as if sudden movements might frighten something fragile. He stopped a few steps away, close enough to matter, but not close enough to intrude. "My mom cried like that once," Elijah said softly. Marcus looked at him, startled. "She did." Elijah nodded. "The night she realized she couldn't pretend anymore." The word slipped past Marcus's defenses and went straight through him. His knees buckled. He dropped back onto the curb hard, the impact jarring but grounding. The sound he made wasn't a sob, not at first. It was raw, involuntary, pulled from somewhere deep and buried. His shoulders hunched inward as the weight he'd carried for decades finally collapsed in on itself. The tears came without restraint, not the controlled kind he'd allowed himself in private moments, but the kind that stole breath and dignity alike. His face twisted, breath hitching as years of repression broke loose all at once. Regret, grief, fear, loneliness, none of it organized, none of it manageable. Marcus Hale, who had terrified cities, wept openly on a curb at midnight. Elijah didn't flinch. He stepped closer now, careful, and sat beside him. He didn't touch Marcus. He didn't speak right away. He simply stayed. Marcus buried his face in his hands, voice breaking. "I don't know how to be better," he whispered. "I don't know if it's too late." Elijah's voice was steady. "My mom used to say waking up hurts, because it means you can't sleep through things anymore." Marcus sucked in a shaky breath. "What if waking up just means feeling all the things I ran from?" "Then you're finally alive," Elijah said. That did it. Marcus's control shattered completely, not in a violent way, but in a yielding one, like a door finally giving way after years of pressure. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, crying freely now, not fighting it, not ashamed of it. Elijah placed a small hand on his arm, not gripping, not claiming. Just there. The contact was light. It felt enormous. Marcus felt something loosen inside his chest, something he hadn't known was locked. The tears slowed, then softened. His breathing steadied gradually, as if his body was relearning how to exist without armor. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his coat, embarrassed but calmer. "I've never let anyone see me like this," he admitted. Elijah looked at him with quiet certainty. "That's why it matters." Marcus stared ahead, the city lights blurring slightly. The fear was still there. The consequences hadn't vanished. Nothing had been solved, but something had shifted. He wasn't collapsing anymore. He was waking up. And in that awakening, painful, humbling, irreversible, Marcus Hale understood that the breaking point wasn't the end of him. It was the moment the life he'd built finally stopped lying to him. And for the first time, he didn't run from the truth. He stayed. The quiet that followed felt different. Not empty. Not heavy. Honest. Marcus sat with his forearms resting on his knees, breathing slowly now, as if his body were learning a new rhythm. The tears had stopped, but their aftermath lingered. A dull ache behind his eyes, a softness in his chest that felt unfamiliar and strangely exposed. Elijah withdrew his hand after a moment, not abruptly, not awkwardly. He seemed to understand instinctively when closeness had done its work. "My mom used to say something," Elijah said after a while. His voice was calm, steady, as if the night itself were listening. "She said life is mostly made of choices people don't think matter." Marcus glanced at him. "Like what?" "Like whether you look at someone or past them," Elijah replied. "Whether you listen when it's uncomfortable. Whether you're kind when it doesn't help you." Marcus leaned back, slightly, considering that. "Kindness never helped me," he said. "It made people take advantage." Elijah nodded. "That happens sometimes." The simplicity of the answer surprised him. No argument. No correction. "But my mom said kindness isn't about what you get back," Elijah continued. It's about who you decide to be when no one's watching. Marcus looked down at the pavement, worn smooth by countless footsteps. I built my life on results, he said quietly. Outcomes. Winning. I never thought about who I was becoming in the process. Elijah picked at a loose thread on his sleeve. Most people don't. They think they'll decide later. And you? Marcus asked. What did you decide? Elijah shrugged, a small, tired motion. I decided I didn't want to be angry all the time. Marcus felt that land deeper than expected. Anger had been his fuel, his shield, his justification. Without it, he believed he'd be powerless. But sitting here, stripped of authority and surrounded by the consequences of that anger, he couldn't deny the cost. Do you ever feel like it's unfair? Marcus asked, that you had to learn things like this so young? Elijah was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Yeah, a lot. Marcus waited, letting the silence stretch. But my mom said unfair doesn't mean useless. Elijah went on. She said pain can teach you what not to pass on. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. He thought of all the pain he'd passed on deliberately, believing it necessary. Strategic. Clean. Now he saw it differently, not erased, not excused, just visible. You think people can really change? Marcus asked, after they've done bad things? Elijah looked at him carefully. Change isn't about erasing what you did, he said. It's about choosing what you do next. Marcus let out a slow breath. That idea felt both terrifying and relieving. He couldn't undo his past. He knew that, but for the first time, the future didn't feel like a trap he had to escape. It felt like a responsibility he could step into. I don't have anything to give, Marcus said. Not right now. Elijah smiled faintly. You do. Marcus frowned. What? You listened. Elijah said, most people don't. Marcus felt a quiet ache in his chest. He had spent his life being heard without ever listening. Tonight, a child with nothing had given him something he didn't know how to measure. Elijah stood and brushed off his pants. I should go soon, he said. It's safer before it gets too late. Marcus looked up sharply. Where are you going? Elijah hesitated. There's a place that lets kids sleep inside if there's room. If there isn't? Marcus asked. Elijah gave a small shrug. I'll figure it out. Marcus stood as well, slower this time, more deliberate. The power he once carried was gone, but something else had taken its place. Not authority. Intent. No, Marcus said quietly. You shouldn't have to. Elijah looked up at him, curious but not hopeful. Hope, Marcus realized, was something this child handled carefully. Marcus met his gaze. You said people choose who they are by what they do next. Elijah nodded. Marcus took a breath. Then let me choose. For the first time that night, Elijah smiled, not polite, not guarded. Real. And in that moment, Marcus Hale understood that wisdom didn't come from wealth or age or power. It came from choosing kindness when you finally realized you didn't have to be the man you used to be anymore. Marcus didn't reach for his phone right away. For once, urgency didn't feel like power. It felt like noise. He stood beside Elijah under the streetlight, the city stretching quietly around them, and let the decision settle fully in his chest before he moved. Where's the place you mentioned? Marcus asked. Elijah pointed down the street. A few blocks. Sometimes they're full. Tonight, Marcus said, we'll make sure they're not. They walked side by side, their pace unhurried. Marcus adjusted his stride without thinking, slowing so Elijah didn't have to rush. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but it mattered for years. People had learned to keep up with him or get left behind. Tonight, he matched someone else's rhythm. As they moved through the city, Marcus noticed details he'd ignored his entire life. The way storefront lights reflected in puddles. The sound of laughter drifting from an apartment window above them. The quiet resilience in Elijah's posture. Alert, aware, but not closed. You don't have to do this, Elijah said after a while. Not suspicious. Just honest. Marcus nodded. I know. Then why are you? Marcus considered the question carefully. Because helping you won't fix what's coming for me, he said. And for the first time, that feels important. Elijah looked up at him, searching his face. Marcus didn't look away. They reached the shelter just before midnight. The building was modest, worn at the edges, but warm light spilled from its windows. Marcus held the door open as Elijah stepped inside, instinctively placing himself behind the boy rather than in front. Another small choice. Another quiet shift. The woman at the desk glanced up, her eyes flicking briefly to Marcus's expensive coat before settling on Elijah. "We're almost full," she said gently, "but let me check." Marcus waited. He didn't interrupt, didn't assert. When she returned with a nod, relief crossed Elijah's face, so quickly it almost broke Marcus all over again. "Come on," the woman said. "We've got a bed." Elijah hesitated, then turned to Marcus. "You don't have to stay." "I know," Marcus replied, "but I will." He watched as Elijah was given clean clothes, food, a place to sit where no one was watching him too closely. Marcus spoke quietly with the staff, not as a man used commanding rooms, but as someone asking questions he should have asked years ago, about programs, about long-term support, about what children like Elijah needed most. When he finally stepped back outside, the night felt different. His phone vibrated in his pocket then. Messages piling up, missed calls finally breaking through, consequences waiting, decisions he couldn't avoid anymore. Marcus didn't delete them. He didn't run. He stood on the sidewalk, breathed in the cool air, and made one call. Not to a fixer, not to a lawyer, to the one person he'd avoided all day. "Tomorrow," he said calmly when the call connected. "I'll be there." He ended the call before excuses could follow. Inside the shelter, Elijah lay on a narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. Marcus paused in the doorway. "Hey," he said softly. Elijah turned. "Yeah, thank you," Marcus said, "for trusting me." Elijah thought for a moment. "You earned it," he replied. Marcus nodded, the weight of that settling deeper than any threat ever had. As he walked back into the night alone, Marcus Hale felt fear still waiting for him, consequences still looming, a future that would demand accountability instead of control. But beneath all of it, something steadier had taken root. For the first time in his life, Marcus wasn't acting to save himself. He was acting to do what was right. And that choice, quiet, irreversible, and real, felt stronger than power ever had. Morning arrived without ceremony. No sirens, no crowds, no dramatic reckoning. Just pale light sliding through the city, revealing the same streets Marcus Hale had walked for years without ever seeing. He stood at the edge of his penthouse window, coat folded neatly over a chair, phone resting untouched on the table behind him. The city below looked smaller in daylight, less threatening, less impressed. He didn't feel forgiven. He didn't expect to. What he felt was awake. The night hadn't erased his past. It hadn't softened the consequences waiting for him. If anything, it had sharpened them. Marcus knew the calls he would make today would not save his reputation. The meetings would not restore his empire. Some doors, once closed, stayed that way. And that was the point. He dressed simply, deliberately. No armor in the tailoring. No performance in the mirror. When he left the apartment, he paused only once, looking back at the space that had held him above everyone else for so long. Then he closed the door. At the shelter, Elijah was finishing breakfast when Marcus arrived. The boy looked up, surprised and careful, as if unsure whether last night had been real. Marcus crouched slightly so they were eye level. "I'm heading out," he said. "There are things I need to face." Elijah studied him. "Are you scared?" Marcus smiled faintly. "Yes." Elijah nodded. "That means you're doing it right." Marcus stood. "You'll be okay here?" "I will," Elijah said. Then, after a pause, "You changed?" Marcus shook his head. "I started to." That felt more honest. He left without promises he couldn't keep, without claiming a future he hadn't earned. Redemption, he learned, didn't begin with declarations. It began with consistency. The building where Marcus turned himself in was cold and procedural. No one trembled when he entered. No one deferred. His name no longer carried weight here. He answered questions plainly, signed what was put in front of him, accepted what came next without bargaining. It was strange how light he felt doing it. Days passed, then weeks. Marcus learned the shape of time without control, learned how silence sounded when it wasn't enforced, learned the humility of listening without responding. He worked where he was allowed to work. He spoke when spoken to. He didn't explain himself unless asked. Some nights were harder than others. Guilt didn't fade quickly. Regret had a long memory. But when it pressed in, Marcus didn't push it away. He sat with it, let it teach him what not to repeat. Through his lawyer, he arranged what he could, restitution where possible, support directed quietly towards shelters and youth programs like the one that had taken Elijah in. No names attached, no announcements made. He didn't want credit. He wanted alignment. Months later, on a supervised afternoon, Marcus sat across from Elijah at a small table in a community center. The boy was taller now, still watchful, still calm. "You look different," Elijah said. Marcus smiled. "So do you." Elijah grinned. "I don't sleep outside anymore." Marcus felt something warm settle in his chest. Not pride, gratitude. They talked about small things. School, books, what Elijah liked to draw. Marcus listened, fully present, with nothing pulling his attention elsewhere. When it was time to leave, Elijah hesitated. "You're not the man you were," he said. Marcus nodded. "I know." "That's good," Elijah added. He looked lonely. As Marcus walked away, he understood something fully for the first time. Redemption wasn't a moment. It wasn't a reward. It wasn't forgiveness handed down by others. It was a quiet decision made again and again to live differently than before. No one applauded. No one erased his past. But Marcus Hale kept choosing. And that was how redemption began. Not loudly, not perfectly, but honestly, one day at a time.